Chapter 15. Screeches and shrapnel had greeted him the moment he left the safety of the building and stepped into a war zone. The heavy doors he had exited automatically sealed as soon as his body was clear, leaving him locked out of the relative safety they had provided. In their stead, emergency blockades had spit from the base's ground before him as he jumped forward for cover. In something close to panic, Rukali grabbed the first thing he could from the rack he had taken shelter behind, which turned out to be a hybrid combat shield. The brace sealed to his left forearm in rapid clicking adjustments as it connected its channels to his suit's shielding generator. He tried to peer out from the rack and get a better view of his surroundings as the shield sprung to a healthy glow on his arm, powering up to an equilibrium state. It gave off the scent of ozone and the steady pulsing ebb of currents as energy ran through the complicated loops which gave it being. Holding the now bright energy shield out on the other side of the makeshift barrier as a distraction for potential incoming fire, Rukali quickly ducked his head around the opposite side of the rack and surveyed the scene. The metallic courtyard was covered in gore and broken corpses, but no incoming fire was observed. Several explosions detonated out in the distance, and he quickly pulled back into safety. In a quick sprint and slide, Rukali slid several units in the grime before he came to a rest with his back against another newly sprouted wall and their racks of combat gear. He had always prided himself on being mentally prepared for battle and the stresses that came with it, but this was something else. This was total chaos. Through the dark and clouded sky, bright green and blue lights flashed in fierce repetition, accompanied by the screech of heated air, which blared in a constant and irregular symphony. Above, from the roof of the building he had just exited, there were 2 mounted plasma turrets, with a small group of gunners. From them rained bolts of heat that singed the hair on his head and chin as they passed for their distant targets. Though Rukali could not see the impacts, he was certain they were landing among the foes beyond the barricade as he heard screams of rage and pain. A bright flash of yellow was followed by the unmistakable sound of a Union bolt rifle firing, a loud crash synchronized with a scream of agony. As Rukali clutched at his spear and readied his shield, he inched his eyes over the edge of the barrier, but quickly had to duck back down as several heavy concussion grenades sailed over to land in front of him. Curling into a ball, he clutched his head in his arms and scrunched his eyes shut as the grenades detonated with a terrific blast of sound, light, and heat. He was thrown from his barricade and back through the muck to rest against the building in a ragdoll fashion. Dazed but alive, Rukali, stumbling to his feet, used his spear as a walking implement as he kept his rectangular shield out and facing his presumed enemies. Barely capable of holding himself upright as spots of vision and vertigo swept through his mind, his thoughts raced. Too much was happening, too quickly. What in all of the fracking void was going on? A shadow burst from the center of his vision, and with that he felt himself slam against the wall, his shield pinning him against its cold metal. Instinctively, his arm thrust out with the jagged spear, and was rewarded with a satisfying crunch and squelch. As he pulled the spear back and forced the thing away from him, he finally got a good look at what he had stumbled into. On the far wall, creatures were pouring over the battlements in droves, their shells and many-jointed claws clamoring against the metal in long scrapes. On the walls and building behind him, he could see several turrets, blasting out in all directions, their plasma fire holding the foes at bay, but only in a small portion. The rest of the base was compromised. As he turned to face the clawed hunters that screeched for blood, he readied his spear and shield, pivoting with his back to the wall. He would have to fight. His face visor formed a translucent blood shield as he marched forward and readied himself. Destroy those before me. The battle began anew. Hiko had gone through 27 rounds already, and those had been used sparingly. The AI turret systems they had managed to bring into operation were far more effective than the piloted version they had thrown together, but unfortunately there were only 3 of those currently working, and they were severely without support. As they tore through with disturbing accuracy, it was just simple math. For every one of the creatures that they brought down, 3 more replaced it. An endless stream of hungry jaws clasping together in unison. The only thing keeping them safe was how far the tree line was. At the distance the creatures needed to cross, the turrets were capable of removing the threats with precision before they ever made it to the walls. Unfortunately, the 2 manned guns were in lesser quality. Generally, things would start out well enough. When the gunners, 2 Al-Alozan, began the nightly rotation, they were fresh. Their shots landed, one after another, despite the lack of light. Their eyes were large, with several deep pupils in each to catch all of the remaining reflected photons. Their species had evolved from a long lineage of nocturnal ancestors, and it showed. Unfortunately, attention and accuracy were not as infinite as the automated counterparts, and in time their shots began to falter. The nights of this planet were long, easily a rotation and a half in standard Union time. To continue with accuracy for such a period would have been the gift of a savant or a hard-practiced combat-trained veteran, and the Al-Alozan were neither. They were simply engineers, just like Hiko. They were all in over their heads. The rifle kicked back with a vengeance as she fired another shot, this time at a creature attempting to claw its way up the nearest wall. Generally, she tried to wait until several lined up, but that particular predator had been ahead of the pack. Its torso split open in a mess of gore as it slipped from its hold and fell to join the others. This had been easier when they had more people. Of the 20 engineers that had originally come down on that final trip from the platform, only 12 were left. Most of those had been lost on the first night when they realized the base's weapon systems were offline. The far side of the base had been compromised in a matter of moments, and the secondary living quarters had been breached. Only the large building section had been left unbreached and in one piece, but even that might be temporary. Every creature they didn't manage to shoot down could easily climb up the walls and break through the glass on the second-floor lookouts. Somehow, their claws seemed to be of a more potent hardness and would scratch weak points into the material in seconds. Hiko fired again. If that base got overrun, the creatures would wait inside, lurking around every corner. As they had found out the second day, the creatures were best fought in the open or not at all. The lower tunnels had all been sealed by permanent lockdown on the second day, and the building below was little more than a 3-floored mess hall. They could not have a repeat of that breach, or they would starve to death in a matter of days, if they weren't overrun long before that. As Hiko sighted in her rifle to movement at the base gates, she froze. How in all the black was that soldier standing? Far below, the soldier that had been put into intensive care and doused with so many nanites it shouldn't even be capable of moving, was arming itself with a hybrid shield plate and preparing for battle. With a sudden burst of speed, it leapt from its cover to dive for another automated arsenal rack. It was actually getting closer to the enemy. Was the warrior insane? Hiko fired another round as she signaled the 2 Oxot by the backup bucket. That was how they had been referring to the grenade bin. It was the only thing that they had actually managed to pry out of the now overrun secondary building and its weapons depot. Their spoils of war, as it were. It had probably been worth it if she had to weigh the scales in all honesty. As they threw 2 of the heavies out into the open courtyard, she saw the soldier react, but not in time. The Oxot's aim had not been perfect, and she cringed as the grenades detonated. In retrospect, obviously they should have warned the poor soul, but they had never expected someone who had been more than half dead to re-emerge in the middle of their kill zone, and they weren't exactly professionals at this sort of thing. The strange warrior was thrown head over heels from the blast and crashed into the wall of their primary building. She let loose what was left in her bolt rifle as covering fire into the courtyard before signaling the Oxots again. If they could get the makeshift ladder down to him, maybe they could pull him up to safety. As she paused to reload, a lone hunter burst from the cloud of dust and misted blood, its strange jaws hinging back to show multiple rows of serrated teeth and several purple tongues. The soldier was done for, and even as the clip clattered into place, Hiko had to force herself not to look away and aim. This wasn't something she wanted to see. As she managed to bring the heavy weapon down upon her target, she saw it rebound off of the energy shield, retaliate in a fierce lunge, and die? It happened so quickly, Hiko hadn't even been sure what had actually occurred. A flash of motion had come from the soldier's arm, and in an instant the attacking creature seemed to go limp, sliding to the ground to join the rest. Somehow, beyond all viable reasoning, the warrior below had survived the assault unscathed, and seemed to be readying itself for more. Advancing several steps forward with its back to the wall, it raised the large rectangular energy shield in front of itself and held the spear to its edge. Hiko could barely make out the war cry through her translator as the soldier bellowed out its chant, but the words reached her, even over the sounds of turret fire and the screeching beasts. Each word was in rhythm with the crash of the metal spear against shield, spraying forth in a volley of sparks. "My duty is to hold the line, and I will hold the line until the line is no more." Hiko opened fire again as more of the creatures burst from the settling dust to fling themselves upon the soldier below. This was going to be a long night. It had taken almost half of the planet's dark period for Zyos to kill the survivor with the bolt rifle, but he had finally done it. The only weapon capable of causing him real and immediate harm had been removed. As an added benefit, its owner was likely being ripped to shreds at the bottom of the battlement. It had not been a simple matter to make that happen, and if Zyos hadn't been able to determine the firing algorithm the AI turrets were utilizing, he would have never made it to the base of the wall still capable of combat. He supposed spending a large portion of his existence in the military had its advantages. In fact, he had probably enlisted before these things were installed. It was an odd thought for him to consider, as his host body dripped blood in a quiet fountain. One of his limbs would be next to useless now, but the strength of the other three were more than capable of achieving his goals tonight. Plan things out and stick to the plan. If Zyos had any true allegiance, it was to that statement. When everything in your life is a calculated risk, and your identity is only allowed to remain for the retention of knowledge, planning for everything becomes more than a necessity. It turns into a motion as natural as breathing. Or, in the case of a Gemind, respiration. Lungs weren't generally worth the effort. His move was planned out for each reasonable scenario, and several unreasonable ones for good measure. When he made his charge, he was ready. As a whole hive of the shelled carnivores seemed to be flowing from the jungle in a torrent of seething hunger, Zyos had waited by the edge of the tree line. The things had gone into a frenzy at the scent of blood from the few originally foolish enough to walk into turret range. Now it was just a giant feedback loop, and there were probably over 1,000 of them. A majority of the creatures would plow straight ahead, but the smarter ones would carve around the sides and flank. Almost all of them avoided the opposing side of the base, where the turrets were posted along the battlements, but even there creatures ran forward and died in droves. This had been the ideal scenario. By using the horde as cover, Zyos had maneuvered himself in zigzag motions, occasionally plucking an unlucky creature from the midst of the pack to raise as a meat shield. When he made it within the coverage provided by the tall outer wall, he waited, and using his new senses, he listened. Sounds almost seemed like another form of sight with this body. When he really focused, Zyos was amazed at what he could determine. There was so much information just out there, floating past, and it could tell him everything he needed to know. At first, in the din of chaotic charges and surges, screams and wails, Zyos had not been sure. From a distance, he had seen figures on the tops of the walls which surrounded the base, but what they carried he could not determine. The beast he now possessed could not see through the haze of the air from such a stretch. Now, though, he could hear, and with this he was certain. After waiting patiently for long enough, he had finally determined where the true threat was positioned. His charge, straight up the wall in 3 quick bounds, had been without hesitation, his claws sinking into the metal and etching indentations of his passage as he finally reached the peak. To the survivor's credit, the defender on the wall managed to fire off a shot as his claws smashed their weapon hundreds of units away from its grasping appendages. It had even managed to throw itself backwards as Zaios had spun in his descent, while lashing out with his tail. He had connected, but not to the degree he had expected. There had been no satisfying crunch with that impact. An eye for an eye, a hit for a hit. Still, the fall would likely clean up what his quick attack had not. As Zaios landed with a heavy impact, he relished in the feeling of soil once again beneath his claws. Using his 3 good limbs, his massive body lunged back for the safety of the far wall. Now that the real threat had been removed, he would wait. Perhaps he would be able to hear the screams of pain. He was honestly beginning to enjoy those. Most life in the Union was fragile. Even out here on the fringes, they were almost all from lower gravity environments than this, or from aquatic worlds. Higher gravity worlds were just less likely to see intelligent life sprout and prosper. Zaios had always wondered exactly why that was. There had been many debates and studies on the topic. Some of the theories rounded the fact that it was much more difficult to break free of orbit, and species would expend their natural resources before they could put a focused effort on leaving their safe and familiar environment. Zaios preferred the more obvious explanation, though. The higher the gravity, the more brutal the life there. Everything on high-gravity planets seemed to be taken to the extreme. When something as simple as standing up and walking on dry land required bones that were on par unit for unit with metal alloys, you could place some bets that the world would be a cruel mistress to any life attempting to prosper. Denser bodies required more caloric intake, which required more food, which required more life. It was no fluke that the most terrifying and dangerous creatures had come from high-gravity planets such as this. A scream sounded from the top of the battlement, and the panicked tones of a struggle shortly after. He could charge soon, get inside that building while the hive of hunters swarmed over what was left of the survivors. He could sniff out his prey's scent, take it over while it was still recovering from its trek to safety. The other survivors had likely stashed it near the main facility's medical bay, and those could be locked down for quarantine scenarios. He could wait it out there, and if he played his cards right, none would be the wiser when rescue finally did arrive. As Zaios prepared to scale the wall and enter the base, he felt something resonate his entire being. Sounds from off in the distant fog gave way to a huge uplifting of small flying creatures, a panicked frenzy taking to the sky. Another, this time a solid shift beneath his scaled feet, threw him to the ground. More creatures took to the sky from the jungle behind him, its foliage shaking from the struggles of life attempting to flee. But flee from what? An earthquake? What were the chances of a... The thought died as Zaios began running straight out across the field. He had a hunch that this might be something much more dangerous. Turret fire ripped across his hide with heavy blasts of plasma, and the scents of cooked flesh began to fill his nostrils, but the body continued. Focusing, Zaios dulled his sensations of pain and withdrew sections of his true body from their intricate webbing throughout the creature's system. As the sprint continued, he tried leaping as he felt another terrible tremor pass through the ground. Below him, the ground actually seemed to tremble, and as he landed, it bucked his body back into the air. A snap was audible as Zaios continued. His weakened limb was now truly ruined and dangling uselessly, but 3 legs would be enough. He could make it far enough away on 3. That turned out not to be the case. The sound of metal on rock, on wood, on flesh overpowered everything as the jungle ripped apart. Trees 15 times his current body's size went flying into the air, and mounds of soil blasted in its wake. It was a ship. If he truly had time to consider the obscenely large metallic rectangular block that was plowing the very planet apart before it. Perhaps Zios might have thought it the ugliest freighter he had ever seen. As it burst through from the tree line and into the open ground before the base, the impact of the upwelling ground shattered his body and threw him airborne in a horribly synchronized manner. Such was how Zios found himself with a view of the red stripe which stretched over the front end of the vessel as it plowed past. It seemed that the shipmaster had come to make her delivery after all. Zios felt a profound sense of irony as his broken body smashed into the ground.